begin there in just a minute. It is good to be here this morning. So many of you I don't know yet, but many of you know me even though I don't remember you because you saw me when I was yay high and have mentioned that to me this morning, and I appreciate the memories that I do have of our time at North Gardendale when I was very young, and the connections that we have through my parents. My dad's Larry Rouse. But I am grateful to be here, and I'm grateful to be able to get to know you and to share in the work that you're doing here, and to thank you for the fellowship that we have together in the work in Pennsylvania. I'm going to begin this morning with just a couple of comments about the work there, and really appreciate y'all sharing in that work with us there, and appreciate the opportunity to be here this week. I'm here with my wife Brianne, our daughter Fiona, and we're expecting, Lord willing, another one in October, if the Lord wills. We are in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania, most people know it's got Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, and my joke is it's Pittsburgh on one side, Philly on the other, and Alabama in the middle. And we're kind of in the middle of this. Harrisburg is, if this will progress for me, clicker is not progressing. I don't know, for our tech guys, if I need to use a different one. I might just use the space bar here. So Harrisburg's right here in the middle. It is the capital of Pennsylvania. Harrisburg itself is not a very large city. The city itself is in the red there. It's about 50,000 people, but the broader area is about 500,000 people, about 500,000 people in the greater Harrisburg area. It sprawls on both sides of the Susquehanna River here. Out on this side, you've got Mechanicsburg and out to Carlisle. On the other side, you've got Hershey, Pennsylvania, where we get Hershey's chocolate from. And again, it just kind of one area goes into the next, and this is about 500,000 people in this area. We meet specifically just on the east shore of the river at the East Shore YMCA right now. And this has been a great location for us. The church started, I guess, officially in about August of 2017. Brianne and I have been there for almost exactly a year. May 1st, this Wednesday, will be 1 year of working with the congregation there. And we've been meeting the YMCA for about a year. It's been really helpful because we've gotten some people who've just kind of walked by, they're there to work out or whatever, and they end up seeing there's a church that meets here on Sunday afternoons, and have come to visit with us and gotten a couple of studies that way. The YMCA is an old mill. It's actually a really beautiful building that we meet in. If you come in the main entrance here and turn left, we're inside this glass door, and so people can see us worshiping in there, hear us sometimes. We meet on Sunday afternoons right now at 2 o'clock for Bible class and 3 o'clock for worship. That originally started because Scott and I, Scott Smelser, who I preached with at Gettysburg, would drive up after Gettysburg services. We do Gettysburg in the morning, Harrisburg in the afternoon, Gettysburg in the evening, which made for a very long but very good Sunday. We're there in Harrisburg now full time. There's another Pentecostal group that meets in the Y in the morning on Sunday. So this is the location, but the main thing is the souls here. This is a little bit of an old picture. This is from last spring, and we've grown by another 6 souls. We've had several people move into the area. The church at the beginning of 2018 last year was just 6 people. But in the space of just over a year, we're 22 now, thanks be to God. And we've had several people move into the area. We haven't had any conversions from the community yet, but we have several studies going in the community and are grateful for those opportunities. Just a little bit of the background of the work. The lady in the middle here in the front is Miss Audrey. And it's in some ways because of her that the work here got started. Her son, Tony, who's standing just behind her, used to worship with us in Gettysburg, and Scott ended up asking Tony, hey, do you know anyone who'd like to study? And basically he said, well, my mom might. Let me ask her. And we ended up studying with his mom, who's in her 80s. She's completely blind, but can read Braille, and so we studied with her. She ended up obeying the gospel a few years ago, and so Scott and I would go up and study with her on Sundays. And that kind of turned into this congregation. When Tim and April Starr moved down, April is Brianne's sister. And then we had several other people move in. I work with Chase Byers, who's there in the back just behind Tony. He moved from Kentucky last February. We moved last May. And so we were working together here in the work in Harrisburg. One thing about the group right now is this calendar year, we have 4 babies on the way in our group of 22. And so we're very grateful to be growing in that way. And Maria and I are expecting in October, Lord willing. Grateful to be with you this week and looking forward to the things we have to talk about. We're going to be focusing our studies this week on the idea of worship, and specifically our worship in song. Worship comes in several different forms, but our singing worship is something that I'm particularly passionate about and I'm grateful to be able to talk with you about. In 1 Corinthians chapter 14, Paul is addressing the church at Corinth, and he's addressing a litany of problems that they had. And one of the things that they were doing is they were using the special gifts that God had given to glorify themselves instead of building up the church. And so 1 Corinthians 14 is all about how to get their mind straight about these special gifts that they have. And one of those things, it was in their singing. In verse 15, 1 Corinthians 14:15, Paul said to them, "What am I to do? I will pray with my spirit, but I will pray with my mind also. I will sing praise with my spirit, but I will sing with my mind also." Your version might say, "I'll sing with the understanding also." And that's where our series comes from this week, is talking about not just singing to kind of check off a box or kind of just fulfill something that we feel like we ought to do, but to engage our hearts and engage our mind or our understanding when we sing. That we're thinking about the words of what we're saying, and we're really letting the words of our songs stir us up to worship. Because if we come together and we sing, but we don't worship, we've just totally missed the point. We're going to be talking this morning specifically about a concept from the book of Hebrews, about worshiping within the veil. So we're going to take some of our imagery from the Old Testament this morning and talk about how this connects to our worship as the people of God in the New Testament. I'll go ahead and apologize. There's a few formatting issues. I'm a Mac guy, and usually when I export to PowerPoint, it goes well, but it wouldn't be a real good meeting without some technical difficulties. So if you see some weird spacing or whatever, I apologize for that. I hope it's not too distracting. I want to begin in the Old Testament before we get to Hebrews in a couple of minutes here, and think about the idea of the priesthood, of what it means to be a priest of God Most High. The priesthood was something that God came up with. He instructed in the books of Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and it was to show God's people what holiness looks like. So there were lots of different manifestations of this. There was the tabernacle, and then later the temple, and all of the ornate decorations that were meaningful to tell the people something about the nature of God. There was the priests themselves and the garments that they would wear that would tell the people something about the nature of God. There were the sacrifices that were to be offered all the time, and then the feast days during the year where there were special things offered, special ways in which they remembered their past and honored God together. One of the things we see, though, is that in God's mind, what he always wanted was a whole nation of priests. Look in Exodus 19 for just a minute. And this is where they come to Mount Sinai. They've just come out of Egypt. And there's going to be, I didn't realize this growing up, but there's either like 7 or 8 times that Moses goes up Mount Sinai. I always kind of thought it was like he goes up Mount Sinai, he gets the tablets, he comes down. That was the thing. But it's like multiple trips if you read Exodus carefully. And this is the very first one. When Moses goes up Mount Sinai, in Exodus 19, in verse 4 beginning, the Lord is speaking to Moses. He says, "You yourselves have seen what I did to the Egyptians, and how I bore you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now, therefore, if you will indeed obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession among all peoples, for all the earth is mine. And you shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall speak to the people of Israel." So Moses goes down Sinai and refers, and Moses kind of runs back up and down. But the first thing that God tells them at Sinai is, look what I've done for you. And if you will fear me and you will follow me, I will make you a nation of priests. And of course, he's going to go on to give instructions that, well, it's going to be really the Levites, and really specifically the house of Aaron, that are going to serve in the tent and be special priests. But I want you all to do the kind of work that a priest does. You're going to be my special people among all the nations. Look in 1 Peter chapter 2. Peter's writing to the strangers and exiles, the Christians who've been scattered throughout the Roman world, in what we now call Turkey. And he says this to them in chapter 2. 1 Peter, chapter 2 and verse 5. You yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And if you skip down to verse 9, it says, but you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for his own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Here's the point that I want to get across to you. Is all of that stuff in the Old Testament, and of course it's the part that disrupts many people's Bible readings, right? You get to like Exodus and then Leviticus, and it's tough reading. There are messages that God is giving us there about what it means to be a priest that apply to us as Christians. Peter is writing to these Christians who have been scattered, who are struggling and suffering, and he says, you need to remember that you are a holy, royal priesthood. And so if you just think about this, if you are a Christian, you are a priest of God Almighty. How often do you think of yourself as a priest? Is that news to you? Is it something you think about a whole lot? Because that's something that we ought to be thinking about. And it helps connect the lessons that God is teaching the Israelites in the Old Testament with what we're supposed to do in the New Covenant. So let's think about this for just a minute. The role of priest really has two dimensions to it. There are all sorts of different things the priest did, and some of them had specific duties. But if you zoom out and kind of boil it down, the priest was supposed to do two things. Number one, the priest was supposed to represent the people to God. And this is probably the role in which we most often think about the priests, is that they were the ones who go into the sanctuary. They go into the tabernacle, into the temple, and they're the only ones allowed in there, right? The priests are the only ones allowed in the holy place. The high priest is the only one allowed in the most holy place, just once a year on the Day of Atonement. But what was the point of all that? What they're doing is they're the ones allowed to approach the very presence of God on behalf of the people. Now, of course, they had to make atonement for their own sins first, because they were sinful people, just like the nation. And after making atonement for their own sins, then they would offer sacrifices for everybody else. But that's the idea, is they're this go-between. They're approaching the presence of God on behalf of the nations. And in doing that, they would offer the sacrifices, they would make intercession, things like that. But that wasn't the only role of the priests. The other dimension of this is that the priests were to represent God to the people. All the things that they were to do, the way they were to live, the way they were to teach, was to be a way of God saying, I am holy, and listen to me, follow me, respect my words and my ways. And so in this role of representing God back to the people, there would be holy clothing that the priests would have, their conduct, their teaching. Look for just a second at Leviticus chapter 10. There's a couple passages here that, again, I think I kind of missed for a while that are relevant to us as a priesthood, as Christians. In Leviticus chapter 10, this is after Nadab and Abihu, God says this in Leviticus 10, verse 8. And the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, drink no wine or strong drink, you or your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. You are to distinguish between the holy and the common, between the unclean and the clean. And you are to teach the people of Israel all the statutes of that the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. The priests were to be teachers. They were responsible not just for hearing God's words and doing them, but then telling the people, here's what God wants from you. Here's what's holy. Here's what's unclean. And to make a distinction. And isn't that so much what our role is as Christians to the world? When we sit down and we open the Bible with them and we're saying, hey, here's what's holy. Here's what's unclean. Here's how you can approach God. Here's what you need to do to be made right with God. And in that sense, we're functioning as a priest. We're serving God. And when we come together in this capacity and we worship God, we're able to come into his presence and to worship him. So there's lots of applications of this. I want you to think for just a minute about the idea of approaching God. And again, this is that idea of the priest representing the people to God. And if you were a priest, let's say that you lived during the time of the wandering in the wilderness, and you're a priest. And God said, I'm going to make my presence dwell in the tabernacle. Like that was the whole point of the tabernacle, right? It's like God's tent. He dwells among his people. But let's say that you live in the camp of Israel, and you get up in the morning and you get out of your tent, and wherever you were in the camp, if you just kind of like looked around and observed the skyline, what would you see, day or night, looking around? If you were in the camp of Israel, you would have seen the pillar of cloud by day or the pillar of fire by night, saying, God is here. God lives among us. But you as a priest, now you have the opportunity to approach the presence of God. So I want you to think about this. So you're a priest, and you're making your way closer to the presence of God. And so you set out through the camp of Israel, through all the tents and different things, people's dwellings, and you're making your way. And as you're getting closer, that pillar of cloud, that pillar of fire is getting bigger and bigger. It's like, wow, like I'm about to go like right in where God is. And so you come to the tabernacle. You come to the courtyard, and you enter into that courtyard. And you would have come first to the altar, but before you can do anything, you need to make yourself clean. And so there was the laver. There was the altar, the laver, and then the holy place, the most holy place. But what they would do is they would go, and as they're approaching the presence of God, they come to this basin, that we call it a laver, and they would wash themselves first. The first thing that we have to understand as we approach a holy God is I have to have clean hands and a pure heart. And clean hands, not just talking about like germs, but talking about like I need to be made innocent, not have blood on my hands, not have guilt on me. I can't just walk into God's presence, living however I want to live, and expect him to accept me. I must have clean hands and a pure heart to draw near to the Lord of hosts. But then, before I'm able to make atonement for my sins, there has to be blood shed. Without the shedding of blood, there can be no forgiveness of sins. And so the priest would go, and there would be an animal sacrificed, a lamb or a goat or a bull that would be offered. And that tells the priest that a death has to occur to allow me to draw near to God. Again, I can't just walk into God's presence of my own accord. There had to be an innocent life taken to even give me access to be near to God. How humbling would that be? Every time you have to come back to approach the presence of God, you're seeing death happen over and over and over again because of what I did, so that then I can go and make atonement for the sins of the people. And when you get into the most holy place, you step into that chamber. What do you still see between you and God? There's a veil. Even then, after the washing and after the sacrifice and after all these things, I still can't go into the very closest presence of God. That's just the high priest. That's just once a year. What is God trying to communicate with all of these things? Well, there's two things that God is communicating with the tabernacle and the temple. One is God is with you. God is dwelling in your midst, and don't take that for granted. But the second is you still got to keep your distance. And I want you to think about how long this went on for. For hundreds and hundreds of years, The only people that could even go into the holy place were the priests. The only person that can go into the most holy place is the high priest once a year. And God is saying, I am holy, holy, holy. You can't be like the gods of the nations, that they do whatever they want and they do all these unholy things in worship to their God. No, not so among you. You have to be holy like me. Look at the priests. Look at what I've set up. And there's this distance from God. And so it goes on like this for centuries and centuries and centuries until one day, I want you to imagine something for a minute. That you're a priest, you've gone into the temple to worship. And there's been some odd things already happening that day. There's been this darkness that's happened, and it's the middle of the day, and that's strange, but here you are, you're serving in the temple. Maybe you're taking care of the showbread or the lampstand or the incense, whatever you're doing. And all of a sudden, you hear this ripping sound. From top to bottom, what happens? The veil of the temple is torn in two. A couple of artist renditions of this that probably don't do it justice to think about the terror of that moment, the shock of what has been off limits for so long is suddenly open. Here's another artist rendition of this, what that might have been like. Think about being there in that moment. That for all these centuries there's been this separation, and all of a sudden the way is open. What would you have done in that moment? Do you dare to step inside? I mean, I don't know what they did in that moment. We just have to kind of imagine and speculate. But I want you to just imagine for just a minute. If you were there in the tabernacle at that moment and you decided the veil's open, no human hand tore this, and just to think about someone stepping inside the veil, what would that be like for you? To be in the most holy place. What would your thoughts be focused on? You wouldn't just step in there lightly. And your thoughts would be focused on the Lord in that place. It's a dramatic moment in history. It's amazing to me how the gospel authors just kind of say, and the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And then they move right on. Isn't that amazing? And of course, what event has happened to tear the veil open? Go with me to Mark chapter 15. This is the moment that an innocent life is taken to give us access to God. Mark chapter 15 and verse 38. We'll start reading in verse 37. And Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. And the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Awesome moment. As we think about the significance of this, when Jesus Christ gave his life for us, the veil was torn open. And now we as God's priests, God's holy people, have access to the most holy place of God, where only the high priest could tread before. Look with me in Hebrews chapter 10. Hebrews chapter 10. And think about how significant this would be to these Jewish Christians to whom the Hebrew author is writing. They would have understood these things for their whole lives. And for him to use this language for this audience would have blown them away, and it ought to blow us away as students of the Bible. Hebrews chapter 10, beginning in verse 19. And this is really at the climax of his argument as he's built up how Jesus is better than the things of the old law. Hebrews 10, verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the holy places by the blood of Jesus, by the new and living way that he opened for us through the curtain, that is, through his flesh. This is the privilege that we have as Christians. Unbelievable. We have access to the most holy place of God through the blood of Jesus Christ. We can enter in the veil. If you told that to one of the Jews in the Old Testament, how would they have thought about that? But you can't just go. And yet through Jesus, we can. So here's what I want us to think about, is this privilege that we have to enter within the veil of the Lord. What ought we to do? How ought we to react? And really, this text is going to give us the rest of our points this morning. Because we have this privilege, what ought we to do? We'll continue reading with me in verse 21. And since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how to stir up one another to love and good works, not neglecting to meet together, as is the habit of some, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day drawing near. As God's holy priest, how are we supposed to use this privilege? He's going to give us three things. This is a great point, right? It says, classic sermon, you got 3 points. So he says, because we have confidence to enter the holy places, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us. And of course, this is classic Hebrews, right? When you study the book. This is the way he encourages them. What's the first thing he says in verse 22? Let us first draw near with a true heart in full assurance of faith, with our hearts sprinkled clean from an evil conscience, and our bodies washed with pure water. Does that sound familiar to you from what we just talked about from the Old Testament? He's saying you need to do your priestly duty. Cleanse yourselves, and in this case, baptism. And he also talks about like the sprinkling of water, which had to do with the ritual cleansings. And he says, you purify yourselves now for service in the true holy place of God. You are a priest. Draw near to God. Brethren, that's what we've got to do when we come here anytime. And not just when we come to a place like this, but in a special way when we come to a place like this. When we come to worship, we're not just here to check some things off a list. We are here to draw near to God. And I don't know about you, but there's times where I struggle with distraction. We've got a 2.5-year-old, and it's very easy to be distracted. But when we come into the presence of God, we need to do everything in our power to, in our hearts and in our minds, draw near to him. If God were to show up this morning and the skies were to be pulled open and we could see the throne of God like Isaiah did or like Ezekiel did, what did they do when they came into the presence of God? They were on the ground. They were on their faces saying, woe is me, I'm undone. I'm a man of unclean lips. I'm in the midst of a people of unclean lips. We would not struggle with distraction when we focus on coming near to the throne of God. And I don't know about you, but this thought has helped me to think about when I come to worship God, whether it's at home and especially when I come into a place like this. Not because this building is like the most holy place or anything like that, but when we approach God at any time, mentally taking that step into the most holy place. The veil has been torn open. And I'm going to now step inside the Holy of Holies to worship my God. He is here. He is present. And I got to give everything I've got to him. Let us draw near. What's the second thing that he says in this text? Verse 23, he says, let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. This is not just something that's practical for our worship, but it's practical for enduring our culture, enduring persecution, enduring the temptations that we face in our families or at school or at work or wherever that is. We've got to hold fast because we have this access to God. Don't let go of that access to God. If we just go the way of the world and let go of being holy, we lose that access to God. We've got to hold fast our confession in a world that wants us to be quiet. We must be open about this access we have and the access that the world can have to God. We have the cure for sin. How can we keep silent about that? Hold fast our confession, for he who promised is faithful. And in verses 24 and 25, we've got to read these two verses together. It's not this, but that. Don't stop getting together, but keep getting together. And what's the point of getting together in verse 24? Let us consider what? Consider how to stir up one another to love and to good works. You know what's really easy to do? To fall into a mindset of when I come to worship, I should consider how everybody else ought to be stirring me up or encouraging me or taking care of my needs. And that's not what this verse says. When you come here, you consider how to stir others up. And brethren, guess what happens when we get out of ourselves and start focusing on others, on how to build them up? Do you know what we end up getting in that process? We end up finding the very encouragement and the very help that we need. That's why we get together. We draw near to God, we hold fast our confidence, and we stir one another up to love and to good works. And that requires a lot of thinking. When's the last time you sat down and said, there's a brother or sister here that I know needs some help to do some more good works or to love more? How can I do that? It's going to look different from situation to situation, but it's you sitting down and doing Hebrews 10:24 that will get you there, and you'll find the help that you need in that process. Look at Hebrews chapter 12, skipping ahead for just a moment. As he's made this amazing contrast between Mount Sinai of the old law and Mount Zion of the new law, he concludes this section by talking about our worship. And he says in verses 28 and 29, Hebrews 12, 28 and 29, "Therefore let us be grateful for receiving a kingdom that cannot be shaken. And thus let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire." That's a great study to do, the consuming fire study. Go and use your Bible app or whatever and look at all the times that comes up. Awesome study. But the point is, God is not to be trifled with. We have to come into his presence with reverence and awe. But the point that he says here is, let us offer to God acceptable worship. God is worthy of our praise. We live in a culture that worships and praises a lot of other things. And let me just tell you this. Everybody worships something. You spend enough time around people, you will find out what they worship. And they may not phrase it in those terms, but you figure out what's most important to somebody, what they talk about, what they praise. Guys, our praise is really important. There are a lot of things that we praise that aren't worthy of the kind of praise that we give them. But when we give the kind of praise where the praise is due, what we praise will change us. The way that we praise will change us. And so he says here, let us offer to God acceptable worship with reverence and awe, for our God is a consuming fire. Look at chapter 13. This is the last one we'll look at. In verse 15, and again, we'll talk about more about this this evening, but think about this from the perspective of the Jewish Christians who are familiar with all of these things. In Hebrews 13, verse 15, he says, through him, that is, through Christ, then let us continually offer up a sacrifice of praise to God. That is the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Do not neglect to do good and to share what you have, for such sacrifices are pleasing to God. If I were to just ask you, before we had done this lesson this morning, do you offer sacrifices? How would you answer that question normally? I don't kill goats in my backyard, if that's what you're asking. Grateful we don't have to do that anymore. But as a Christian, do you offer sacrifices? And the answer better be yes. And all the things that we learn about the sacrifices in the Old Testament tell us something about the kind of sacrifices we ought to be offering as priests of God under the New Covenant. We're going to talk more about that tonight. But do you see what the Hebrew author is trying to tell us in all this? Because God has done these incredible things for you, because he has brought this high priest over the house of God, and all of these shadows are fulfilled in Jesus, you are able to enter through the veil into God's most holy place. Let us draw near. Let us hold fast. Let us consider one another. Let us worship with reverence and awe. And let us offer the sacrifice of praise, the fruit of lips that acknowledge his name. Brethren, if we will think about worship in these terms, I really believe it will change us. It will change our worship collectively. It will change our worship privately. Hopefully we'll talk about that Wednesday night a little bit and talk about making hymns a habit. It will change the way that we serve one another. It will change the way that we look at our role to the world and us seeking to bring them to God, to be in a sense, a mediator, not in the sense of Jesus and the Holy Spirit, but in bringing people to God and helping them to be made holy. We are a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood, and we must take this role seriously. I hope these thoughts have been encouraging to you this morning, challenging. We're going to expand on these ideas and talk about these in the lessons to come this week. We want to extend the Lord's invitation this morning, and it is the invitation to be holy. We sang that song this morning, didn't we? Holy, holy, holy. And I hope while you were singing that song, you thought about Isaiah 6 and about the seraphim that are praising God before his throne day and night. They never cease to say that. And if you realize this morning that you are unholy and that you need to get the sin out of your life, whether that's for the first time in repenting of their sins, being buried with Jesus in baptism, washing away those sins so that you can approach the presence of God, or whether you're a Christian and you need to get sin out of your life or need the prayers of the brethren here, that you don't leave this place unless you're in a right relationship with God. You've got the opportunity to do that this morning. If there's any way that we can help you to be right, to become a priest if you need to, or to serve better as a priest, let us know while we stand and while we sing.